She discovered an abandoned ship in the jungle, a massive rusted vessel hidden deep within the rainforest, where no ship should ever be. Locals called it cursed. But inside the abandoned ship, she found something chilling: a photo of her mother, taken 2 years before she was born. What began as curiosity became a shocking jungle ship mystery that unraveled a decades-old cover-up. This emotional story will stay with you long after the video ends. Subscribe now and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Let's get started. The jungle wasn't on any tourist map. Dense, humid, alive in a way that made your heartbeat echo louder than it should. Sophia Blake had been hiking solo for 4 days, part fieldwork, part escape. She wasn't chasing adventure, just silence, maybe closure. But what she found instead was impossible. There it was, an entire ship, rusted, towering, covered in moss and vines like the earth had tried to swallow it but couldn't quite forget. It sat there in the heart of the rainforest, as if it had crashed through time instead of water. Sophia's boots crunched on roots and wet soil as she stepped closer. Eyes wide, breath held. Her backpack thudded gently against her spine, but she barely noticed. No river nearby. No floodplain. Nothing that could explain how a ship got here. She circled it slowly, heart pounding harder with each step. Its hull was torn open in places. Trees had grown through its broken decks. The air around it felt heavy, not haunted, but watching. She hesitated. Then, gripping her flashlight, she climbed aboard through a jagged hatch. What she saw inside made her go completely still, because in the shadows of that rotting steel belly was a photograph, one with her mother's face, taped to the wall, and dated 2 years before she was even born. The flashlight flickered as Sophia stepped deeper into the steel bones of the ship, the light carving narrow tunnels through the dust and hanging vines. The jungle was behind her now. Out there, the air buzzed with life. In here, it felt like time had stopped. The smell hit her first metal. Mold. Something like old seawater and rusting dreams. Her boots echoed against the buckled floor as she moved slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't stop staring at the photo taped to the wall. Her mother, smiling, wearing the exact red scarf she was buried in. Sophia reached out and touched the photograph gently, her gloved fingers trembling. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, "Property of C. Blake, July 1987. C. Blake." Her mother's name was Carolyn. Sophia staggered backward, the flashlight slipping in her grip. A wave of disbelief crashed into her. She was born in 1989. This photo was dated 2 years before she was even born. What was her mother doing here? And why had she never mentioned this place? Sophia had grown up with pieces of her mother's past, scraps of stories about coastal towns and stormy nights, always romanticized, never specific. Her mom died of cancer when Sophia was only 16. There were no journals, no family heirlooms, just a woman who loved old sea shanties and drank her coffee with too much sugar. And now, a photograph taped inside the hollow corpse of a ship that no one knew existed. She needed air. Spinning around, she rushed back to the hatch she'd come through, but something made her stop. A sound. Barely there. A metallic creak, not from her, not from the wind. Something deeper, like movement. Sophia held her breath. The jungle was far too dense for anyone to follow her here. Mateo, the guide, had refused to return after the first trip. He'd said the ship was cursed. "It calls the broken," he muttered, "and buries what it doesn't want the world to remember." She'd laughed at him then. Now she wasn't so sure. Slowly, cautiously. She turned back down the hallway. Her flashlight beam shook slightly as she walked. Through a door half ripped from its hinges, she found what once must have been the captain's quarters. Inside was a desk, a metal filing cabinet, and a cot with a rotting mattress. But it was the journal on the desk that drew her forward. Covered in mildew, leather warped with time, it still bore the initials. C.B. Hands shaking, she opened the first page. July 2nd, 1987. If I vanish, let this be the truth that follows me. Sophia sat down, reading line after line. It wasn't just a travel journal. It was a confession. Her mother had come here as a marine biologist, researching a vessel believed to have disappeared in 1969 off the Pacific coast. But the ship hadn't sunk. It had drifted, pulled by ocean currents, lost for nearly 2 decades until it somehow ran aground, hundreds of miles inland, carried in pieces by storms and floods, before the jungle wrapped around it and made it disappear. Caroline had been one of the first to find it. But she hadn't been alone. There were others, men who had tried to cover it up, men who believed the ship held something more than rotted steel. She didn't say what only that the logs weren't just ship logs. They were evidence. She had hidden them, she wrote, and someone had followed her. She mentioned a man only as the navigator. She said he didn't have a name, only an agenda, that he warned her once. You keep digging, and this place will bury you too. Sophia felt a chill rise up her back. In the next entry, her mother wrote about fleeing, taking one final photograph to prove she had been here. Then, nothing. The last page was torn out. The journal ended. Sophia stood slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Her breath felt tight, her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the overwhelming sense that she had walked into a story that wasn't meant to be finished. Suddenly, the flashlight dimmed, then died. She smacked it against her palm. Nothing. She was alone, in a rusted corpse of secrets, holding her dead mother's journal, and something was still watching her. Her heart thudded louder now, almost painfully. She felt along the walls in the dark, fingers brushing rust and webs, trying to retrace her steps. Then her boot struck something. A metal box. She knelt and pulled it into what little light seeped in from the broken hull. It was bolted shut, but there, etched across the top in barely legible script. Navigation log, 1969, capped, Elias Roth, classified. The very logs her mother had written about. She pulled out a small penknife from her pocket and began prying the lock. It gave way with a screech. Inside dozens of pages, typed and handwritten, some water-damaged but legible, coordinates, names, mentions of a secret operation, something about signal jamming and experimental tech, notes about unregistered cargo and unauthorized detainment of civilians. And then photos. One of them showed a woman in a white lab coat. Young, strong. Her mother. Behind her the same ship. Beside her a man with a scar down the side of his neck. The same man from the old family photo Sophia had seen her entire life, but never asked about. She thought he was just a friend. Her hands began to shake. A crash echoed through the belly of the ship. Sophia shot up, heart pounding. Something had fallen, or someone had entered. She grabbed the logbook, the journal, stuffed them into her bag, and ran back down the corridor, over the creaking floor, into the suffocating green light of the jungle beyond. Branches scraped her arms. Her boots slipped in the mud. She didn't stop until she reached the trail marker she'd left behind, an old red ribbon tied to a sapling. When she finally looked back, breath ragged, she saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the ship's rusted bow, watching her, not moving, just there, like it had always been. She didn't scream. She just whispered to herself, "What did you find?" Mom and who didn't want it found. That night, Sophia didn't sleep. She pitched her tent miles away from the ship, heart still thudding from what she'd seen and what she hadn't. The figure at the ship's bow wasn't a hallucination. She knew it. The way it stood still, purposeful, not like something watching her, but like something waiting. She clutched the journal against her chest. Her mother's words felt heavier now, no longer echoes from the past, but warnings. The navigator is real. They don't bury secrets. They anchor them. Sophia stared into the dark canopy above her tent as insects buzzed outside and distant howls echoed through the jungle. In her mind, she kept replaying the moment the flashlight died. The journal, the logbook, that photograph, and that man beside her mother. Who was he? She had to go back, not out of curiosity, but to finish what her mother started. At dawn, she returned. This time, she wasn't careful. She wasn't quiet. She didn't care if the jungle knew she was coming. The ship rose before her like a rusted cathedral swallowed by the earth, its jagged hull sliced through the green like a forgotten knife. And yet, it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt familiar, like something calling her home. Sophia stepped through the same torn hatch, heart steadier this time. The light poured in through broken windows now, shafts of gold cutting through decay, and something had changed. The photo was gone. Where it had been taped, only 4 torn corners of yellowed tape remained. She moved quickly through the corridors, retracing her steps to the captain's quarters. The metal box she'd pried open the day before was still there, but its contents had been rifled through. And something else caught her eye. Footprints. In the dust. Heavy. Recent. Someone else had been here. Or maybe still was. A chill prickled her skin as she closed the logbook and turned back to the hallway. That's when she heard it. The voice. Muffled, distant. A recording. She followed it past collapsed doors and shattered windows, until she reached a lower deck. There, behind a barely hinged steel door, was a room she hadn't dared open before. Now it stood slightly ajar. Sophia stepped in, and froze. It was a makeshift radio room. Broken monitors, coiled wires, shattered microphones. But on the table was a still blinking cassette player. Crackling! Playing on loop. If you're hearing this, you need to understand this place was never meant to be found again. The cargo, it wasn't weapons, it wasn't drugs. It was people, scientists, test subjects. They were trying to erase the data. That's why they ran aground. That's why we were left here. The voice was male. Calm, broken, and unmistakably American. Sophia leaned closer. The tape continued. See, Blake tried to stop them. She got away, but they followed her. She took the evidence. She said she had a daughter. If she's hearing this now. The tape clicked off. Silence. Sophia backed away slowly, mind reeling. Her mother hadn't just discovered the ship. She had escaped it. And now Sophia knew why her life had always felt like a puzzle missing its corners. She wasn't just born into mystery. She was born because of it. Suddenly, something crashed above her. Not an animal, boots. Someone was here. Sophia turned off her headlamp, held her breath, and pressed into the shadows. Heavy footsteps moved across the top deck. She counted 3 distinct pairs, moving deliberately, not tourists, not locals. Looking for something. Or someone? She waited, heart pounding, until the voices faded. Then she moved. Fast. Silent. Every part of her on high alert. Back through the corridor. Up the broken stairwell. Toward the hatch. And then she saw him, standing in the doorway. The man from the photograph. Older now. Gray hair. that same scar running down his neck. He didn't flinch. Didn't speak. He simply looked at her like he'd been expecting this moment for decades. "You're Caroline's daughter," he said, voice low. Sophia didn't answer. She just gripped the satchel tighter. He stepped aside. "They're already coming. If you want to know the rest, you'll have to trust me." She hesitated. Everything inside her screamed to run. But another voice, her mother's, echoed from the journal. Sometimes the only way out of a cage is through the man who built it. So she stepped past him, out into the jungle light. They didn't speak as they walked, cutting through a hidden trail behind the ship, covered with vines and overgrown ferns. After 20 minutes, they reached a small hut, camouflaged beneath layers of brush and bark. Inside, radio equipment, water jugs, maps, and a single black and white photograph on the wall. A group of men in military uniform, all standing in front of the same ship. At the center, her mother, younger, confident, holding a briefcase. "She was one of us," the man said, until she realized what we were really doing. Sophia turned to him. "What were you doing?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the photograph, his voice brittle. "Human testing, on civilians, on wanderers, people who wouldn't be missed." Sophia felt sick. "The jungle didn't swallow this ship," he added. "It chose to keep it. And now, you found it. Just like she did." He handed her a small device, a USB drive, wrapped in plastic. Everything she tried to protect. All the proof, it's in here. Sophia took it with shaking hands. "Why now?" she whispered. He looked at her, tired. "Because you came back, and because ghosts don't rest until someone finally listens." That night, as the jungle wind rattled the canopy, Sophia sat in the dark, the USB drive in her lap. She didn't know if she would survive what came next, but she knew one thing for certain. The truth was no longer buried. It had been found, and it had her mother's name all over it. The rain came hard that night. Thick jungle drops pounding the roof of the hut like fists desperate to be heard. Sophia sat in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, the USB drive clutched in her hand like it might vanish if she let go. She hadn't said a word since the man, the one from the photo, the one who knew her mother had handed it over. She didn't even ask his name. He didn't offer it either. Names didn't seem to matter anymore. Not in this story. Not when the world she thought she knew was falling away like rotting bark. At dawn, she plugged the drive into her field laptop. It booted slowly, screen flickering like it too hesitated to reveal what it held. A folder appeared. 6 week last files. She clicked it open. Inside, dozens of PDF files labeled personnel, ship manifest, unlisted cargo, audio recordings, some distorted, others crystal clear, a video titled Testimony. 1987.move. Sophia's breath caught. She clicked play. The screen was grainy, washed in sepia. But there, sitting before a rusted table in a room lit by a single hanging bulb, was her mother, Caroline Blake. Hair pulled back in a loose bun, eyes tired, voice steady. "If you're watching this, I'm likely gone, or running, or worse. My name is Caroline Blake. I was part of Operation Halcyon. We were told it was about environmental research, climate data, but it wasn't. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a prison." Sophia blinked, tears rising. Her mother continued. "We were monitoring human responses to isolation, chemical exposure, and psychological stress. Volunteers, they said. But none of us volunteered for what came after. One night, we intercepted a radio signal, coordinates, not military, civilian, a distress call." Caroline paused in the recording, voice trembling. "We found a lifeboat, 7 people inside, lost. We took them in. They weren't on any manifest. That was the mistake. The moment they stepped on board, we became part of something we couldn't unsee. Sophia froze. One of the survivors, Elias Roth, had proof, documents, tapes, photos. He gave them to me, told me to run. I did. And now, I leave them for you. For the daughter I hope one day will understand that silence is betrayal. The screen went black. Sophia sat motionless, hot tears sliding silently down her cheeks. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a mission. She spent hours going through the files. Some of it made no sense: medical charts, long strings of coordinates, redacted memos. But other parts were painfully clear. Multiple recorded interviews of surviving crew. A ledger listing unreported detainments, names of people marked non-essential. A map, not of sea routes, but crash sites. And in the middle of the map, circled in red, latitude 9.35 and longitude tantamantaturo per second 6 and 7 beef dontuanzo, right where the ship now sat, buried in the jungle, like it had always meant to be forgotten. Sophia printed what she could, packed the journal, the drive, the logbook, the audio tapes, everything. She didn't say goodbye to the man in the hut. When she turned to leave, he only nodded like passing a baton in a race that had taken 30 years to complete. "Where will you go?" he asked. Sophia paused. Back. Back where? She met his eyes. To the world that forgot this story, so it never forgets again. It took her 4 days to reach the nearest outpost. 2 more to contact a journalist she trusted, a woman she'd met once at a climate summit. Someone who had once told Sophia, "If you ever find something big, something real, don't sell it, tell it." They met at a weather-worn cafe in San Jose. Sophia placed the journal and USB on the table between them. "This isn't a story," she said. "It's a resurrection." The journalist spent the next 3 hours reading in silence. Then, finally, looking up, eyes glassy, voice low. This is going to burn things down." Sophia nodded. "Let it." Weeks passed. Then came the article. Then the second. Then the interview request from a global news network. Then the whispers from old retired officials, some anonymous, others bold enough to say, "I remember Halcyon. I thought it was buried." People started listening. And that's when something strange happened. Letters started to arrive. Emails, voicemails. People who had family that vanished during the 80s. Others who had received unsigned postcards from jungle towns. Everyone had a missing piece. And now they had a map. Sophia sat alone one night in her small apartment above a bookstore. The rain tapped on the glass like an old friend. Her laptop glowed with an inbox of stories, names, grief. She opened a blank document and typed the first sentence of her book. "My mother died when I was 16, but she didn't disappear until I was 34. She hit save, then leaned back, hands trembling but lighter somehow. Not because the work was done, but because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from a shadow. She was walking towards the light it had always tried to hide." The article went viral. At first, it was just a niche blog post published by a small, independent investigative outlet, the kind of place known for truth-telling but not trend-making. Then came the reposts, the citations, the TikToks, the late-night segments. And then the outrage. Sophia sat quietly in the back of a crowded university auditorium, watching her mother's face flicker across a projector screen as a panel of historians, whistleblowers, and journalists debated the impact of what they now called the Blake Files. She couldn't stop staring at the photo, the same one that had once been taped to the rusted wall of a ghost ship. Her mother. smiling, unaware of the legacy she was leaving behind, not just for her daughter, but for the world. It wasn't just about the ship anymore. It became a symbol of how the world forgets inconvenient truths, of how silence isn't always peace, of how some places buried under jungle and shame were never meant to stay hidden. A week later, Sophia received a call from a foundation in Geneva. "We want to open a permanent exhibit," the woman on the phone said. "A memorial, something that honors those who vanished and those who told the truth." Sophia hesitated. "It's not a museum piece," she said. "It's still alive." "Exactly," the woman replied. "That's why it matters." The offer opened doors she didn't expect. University lectures, human rights panels, a publishing deal. But Sophia turned most of it down. Not out of pride, but because she knew something no one else truly understood. The story wasn't finished. Because deep in the jungle, the ship still stood. And she hadn't told them everything. Not about the voice, not about the man, not about the final file she hadn't shared. There was one folder on the USB marked S.B. for her eyes only. It was locked. Password protected. She tried everything. Dates, names, places. Nothing worked. Until one night, in the quiet stillness of her room, she whispered something aloud, almost without thinking. Seahart. It was what her mother used to call her. A bedtime name. A nickname that had always sounded like part of a lullaby. The screen blinked. The folder opened. Inside was a single audio file. Her mother's voice, clear, close. "Sophia, if you're hearing this, it means you found it. And I'm sorry, Guau. I wanted to keep you out of this. I wanted you to have a life untouched by what I couldn't undo. But you've always been braver than I ever was." Sophia covered her mouth as the recording continued. "There are others, like me, still alive, still hiding. They need someone to find them, and I think it has to be you." Then silence. A second later, a file appeared, coordinates. Multiple locations, spread across Central and South America. Other ships, other sites. Sophia stared at the screen, heart thundering. This wasn't over. It was barely beginning. She didn't tell anyone at first. Not the journalist, not the professor who offered her a fellowship, not even Mateo, the guide who had once warned her to stay away. She booked a one-way flight to Ecuador. With only a backpack, her mother's journal, and the list of coordinates burned into her brain. She knew she couldn't do it alone, so she found others. People who had written to her after the story broke. A daughter whose father vanished near the Venezuelan coast in 1986. A former marine biologist who once heard rumors of floating prisons. A man who worked in radio surveillance, who said he once intercepted a signal marked Operation Halcyon, but was told to erase the file. They weren't experts. They were witnesses. And together, they became something stronger. A movement. They called it The Wake, a project to track and uncover lost evidence of secret government operations buried in forgotten places. Not just ships, but bunkers, facilities, archives, and with every lead, every whisper from the past, they uncovered something new. Stories. Of survivors, of runaways, of people who were told no one would ever believe them. Now, they were being believed. Because Sophia hadn't just found a ship in the jungle. She had found a key to a door that had been welded shut by fear, and behind it voices the world had ignored. One day, nearly a year after she first stepped aboard the rusted ship, Sophia stood at a podium in Copenhagen. 1,000 people filled the conference hall. She wore a simple jacket, her mother's compass pinned to the collar. She spoke not like a scholar, not like a celebrity, but like a daughter. Like a woman who had heard something she couldn't unhear. "I didn't come here to be famous," she told the crowd. "I came here because silence has an echo, and I was raised in the space it left behind." She paused, then continued. "My mother didn't want to be remembered as a hero. She just wanted to be heard. And now, I carry that forward, not as a burden, but as an invitation. She stepped back from the mic, and the room stood for her, not for the applause, but for the truth. Outside, the rain fell softly, and somewhere, far away deep in the jungle, a ship exhaled through rusted lungs. Because someone had finally come back. And this time, they weren't leaving. Sophia stood at the edge of a river in northern Ecuador, the water slow and glassy beneath the fading light. She held the compass in her hand, her mother's compass, its needle dancing erratically, as if even it didn't know which direction to point her anymore. It had been 8 months since the first article, 5 since the first anonymous tip about a second vessel, 3 since she'd found the journal of another survivor, one who didn't survive long enough to tell his story. And just a week ago, she'd found something that made her wish she hadn't opened the next door. A manila envelope, no return address, mailed to the community center in Costa Rica where she had left a P.O. box, just in case. Inside a single Polaroid photo, yellowing at the edges, her mother, lying unconscious on the deck of the ship, and standing over her, face in shadow, the man who gave Sophia the USB. Her hands shook for hours after seeing it. That night, she sat alone in a worn-out shack rented for $10 a night, no electricity, only candles, and stared at the photo for what felt like forever. "You trusted him," she whispered. "I trusted him." But trust had always been a fragile thing in this journey. She remembered something her mother wrote in the final pages of her journal. The people who know the most will either protect you completely or betray you without blinking. So far, Sophia had seen both. In the weeks that followed, she stopped answering media requests, turned down documentary offers, ignored emails from people wanting to option the rights. She didn't want fame. She didn't even want justice, not in the way the world demanded it. She wanted peace. But peace never comes in straight lines. It comes in slow, painful waves. One afternoon, she visited a small village near the border of Peru, a place she'd been told about by a former radio operator who once claimed, drunkenly, that a woman who looked like a ghost had passed through in 1988. Sophia brought the photo. An older woman in the village stared at it, squinting through cataracts. Then she said, in Spanish, "She stayed in that blue house, didn't talk much, wrote letters every night she burned before dawn." Sophia asked if any of those letters were kept. The woman shook her head, but said one thing that stuck. She cried without sound. That's how I knew it was real. That night, Sophia sat under the stars outside the blue house, now empty. The roof caved in, and for the first time in months, she let herself cry, too. Loudly. Not because she was broken, but because she was finally soft enough to feel it. Over the next few months, Sophia stopped chasing every lead. Instead, she started listening more. To the stories people told her. To the ones they whispered when no one else was around. To the way their hands trembled when they handed over old postcards, broken compasses, even torn pieces of uniforms. Some had no proof at all, just memory. But that was enough, because memory when shared is proof of presence. She began writing again. Not a memoir, not an exposé, but a collection of short entries she titled Letters I Wish She Could Read. One entry read, "Dear Mom, I used to be angry you didn't tell me. Now I understand. Some stories don't survive in daylight, but I will carry yours anyway." Another, "Dear me, you're allowed to rest. You're allowed to let the story breathe without bleeding you dry." Then came the message, left anonymously on the voicemail of a regional radio station she had visited during an outreach project. "She's not gone. Not completely. The jungle has a memory. Room 7, Agua Clara Clinic, Northern Coast. Ask for La Luz." Sophia listened to it 5 times. Could it be real? Another lead, another ghost. She almost deleted it. But her mother had once said, "The wildest truths come in whispers." So she packed a bag and followed the whisper. Agua Clara was little more than a worn white building by the sea, surrounded by palm trees and salt air. She walked in, journal pressed to her side like a shield. The nurse at the desk raised an eyebrow. "I'm looking for someone called La Luz." The nurse stared at her for a long time, then pointed down a hallway. "Room 7. Sophia stepped quietly to the door and knocked. No answer. She turned the knob slowly, heart pounding. And there, sitting in a rocking chair by the window, was an old woman. Gray-haired, thin, quiet, eyes closed. But when Sophia said, Caroline, the woman opened her eyes and whispered, "You came home?" It wasn't her mother, but it was someone who knew her, someone who had survived, someone who, for the first time in years, remembered out loud. Her name was Elena. She had been on the ship, she had escaped with Caroline, and she had been waiting. Not for rescue, but for someone brave enough to come back. She handed Sophia a small pouch, stitched shut with faded red thread. Inside a letter, written in her mother's handwriting. "If she ever finds you, give her this." Sophia didn't open it right away. She sat outside the clinic for hours, staring at the sea. When she finally opened it, the ink was faded, but the words were clear. "My Sophia, if you've made it this far, it means you've walked the road I couldn't finish. And I'm so sorry for that. But know this, I never wanted to protect you from the truth. I just wanted the truth to find you when you were strong enough to carry it, and now you are. I love you. Always. Mamsu." That night, Sophia lit a candle on the sand and placed the letter beside it. The waves rolled in gently, and for the first time, she didn't feel haunted. She felt whole. Because healing doesn't come when we find the answers. It comes when we face the pain and choose to keep walking anyway. A year to the day since she first stepped onto the rusted bones of that forgotten ship, Sophia Blake returned. She came alone. No film crew, no interviews, no expectations. Just her in the jungle. The path was more overgrown now, the vines thicker, the moss deeper. Like the forest was slowly reclaiming everything again. But the moment she stepped into the clearing, there it was. The ship. Silent. Still. Exactly where it had been waiting. She ran her hand along the hull, now softened by time and green. Her breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but reverence. It wasn't a wreck anymore. It was a monument. Sophia climbed the same stairs she had once ascended in fear. Only this time, she didn't hesitate. She stepped into the captain's quarters, where the light now poured through a broken window in gold sheets, where the desk remained and the floor still groaned beneath her boots. She opened her satchel and pulled out the last letter, the one from her mother, the one Elena had kept all those years. She placed it gently inside the drawer of the desk, closed it slowly, and whispered, "This is where it belongs." She didn't need to dig for more, didn't need to uncover what was already found. This trip wasn't about answers anymore. It was about honoring the silence that had once been a scream. Later that evening, Sophia set up a small canvas tent near the base of the ship. She lit a lantern, made coffee over a small burner, and watched as the fireflies flickered between trees like living embers. She thought about everything this journey had taken from her, but she also thought about what it had given her. A voice that no longer trembled, a truth that no longer needed permission, and a mother she no longer grieved, but carried forward. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They say grief is a tide, but sometimes it's a river, and when you follow it long enough, you don't drown, You arrive? In the months that followed, Sophia founded a non-profit called The Second Wake. Its mission wasn't flashy. It didn't promise justice. It didn't promise answers. It promised something braver. A place for unfinished stories to rest. A room where people could speak their truth even if no one had believed them before. A promise that forgotten voices wouldn't stay forgotten. They collected letters, recordings, drawings from children who never knew their fathers but finally understood where the silence came from. And they didn't hide these stories. They archived them, shared them, held them like sacred stones in a world too quick to bulldoze memory. People began to return to the jungle. Not in waves, but in quiet ones and twos. A daughter from Belize, holding a photograph of her aunt last seen in '87. A man who had dreamed about the ship since he was 6. A teacher from Guatemala who said her father had once warned her. If you hear the jungle hum, listen. It means someone is still telling the truth. They came, and they cried, and they left small items by the ship's hull. A seashell, a poem, a compass. Sophia collected none of it. She let the ship keep it all, because some things aren't meant to be removed. Some things need to belong to the silence. One morning, just as the mist began to lift from the trees, Sophia received a package. Inside a printed manuscript. The title, Sea Heart. The true story of a daughter who listened. Below it, a note. You gave us a new way to tell the truth. We wanted the world to hear it. You don't owe us anything, but we owe you everything. It was from survivors, from children of the lost, from people who had no voice until Sophia stood in that jungle with nothing but a flashlight and a question. The book became more than a memoir. It became a movement. Schools began using it to teach empathy. Psychologists referenced it in studies on intergenerational trauma, and survivors who had never dared speak before. They wrote and signed their names. Years later, Sophia returned to the jungle one final time. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a young woman with bright eyes and a folded journal in hand. A university student, a researcher, someone who had read Sea Heart and said, I think I'm ready to listen now, too. Sophia smiled and handed her the compass. It doesn't point north, she said, but it always finds the truth. As they stood before the ship, the wind stirred gently, leaves rustling like a hush across generations. Sophia looked up one last time. The jungle was still. The silence was warm, and the ship seemed to exhale. Because this wasn't a wreck anymore. It was a witness. To grief, to courage, to legacy. And because one woman came back, none of it had to stay buried. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do isn't to speak, but to listen. Listen to the stories the world tried to erase. Listen to the silence we inherited from those who couldn't tell their truth. Listen to the parts of ourselves we buried, thinking they were too broken, too heavy, too strange to matter. Sophia Blake didn't set out to be a hero. She simply followed a whisper, one photograph, one broken compass, one unanswered question, and it led her to something the world had forgotten. That every voice matters, that truth doesn't expire, and that healing begins the moment someone finally says, I believe you. We don't need to find a ship in the jungle to change a life. We just need to create space where someone feels safe enough to be heard. The end. Up next, 2 more unforgettable stories waiting to be heard. Click to keep listening and hit subscribe if you believe that even the quietest voices deserve to echo.